since this is the start of a new school year and a new semester at Kenyon, we're going to start out with a pop quiz. So, who knows the meaning of the word perenniology? Any takers? It is the study of Proverbs. It's a whole academic discipline. So those of you who know me probably know that my academic background before I went into seminary was in medieval studies. But specifically, I studied Proverbs, early English Proverbs. And so I did a lot of, there was a point in my life when I had checked out the entire, Germanic tome that was the, dictionary of Proverbs in, European Proverbs, and was lugging them around the library. It was a time. But one of the things, whether it's proverbs, maxims, precepts, gnomic utterances are a thing, what unites all these little bits of sententious wisdom is that they describe the world in various ways, right? Whether it's a phrase like out of the frying pan into the fire to discuss, going from one problem to a different one, or like in the Old English world that I studied, observations like fire is hot and frost is cold. Excellent. These sayings are ways of describing the world as it is. They are inherently descriptive. And I think one of the temptations that we can get into, and one of the problems that we can get into when it comes to our Christian faith and understanding the teachings of Jesus, is to see him as some kind of proverbial teacher, some kind of person offering us life advice for how to navigate the complexities of the world, rather than, in fact, the embodiment, the manifestation of God's kingdom, God's world that comes into conflict with ours and upends our reality. And I think that comes into play quite a lot with today's gospel reading, which tells the story of Jesus at another one of these dinners with the religious leaders of his time, and it describes a scene that I think we can all relate to, right? Despite the centuries and the great cultural chasms that can divide us from the world of the New Testament in a lot of its specifics, I think absolutely all of us can understand the framework of a social event, a dinner party, orientation, get to know you mixer, where it feels like maybe we're talking to someone, and maybe out of the corner of their eye, they're always looking out for someone more socially advantageous that they could be connected to, right? Or how to leverage a relationship to a, either social capital or professional capital. But there is always that sense of looking at what you can get, and how you can use another person for your advantage or your position. And it's, to some degree, that's the first half of our gospel, especially this morning, looks like it's just some practical advice for how to get by in the social dynamics of the world. Don't set yourself up to be humble. Don't set yourself up to be the most important person so that you might get knocked down a peg, but set yourself up, use humility to your advantage. Be strategic, right? Set yourself up in a lower place so that you might then be elevated. And it seems like Jesus may be offering us that type of advice that, for those of you who were at the opening convocation at Kenyon, that type of advice that Provost Bowman was rightly ridiculing throughout history. But as is always the case with Jesus, there is something more and there is something deeper going on. Especially when we look at the last couple of verses of our gospel reading, where Jesus sort of flips it on his head. Rather than saying, here's how to appropriately navigate this social reality that is based on transactional exchanges of what you can do for each other and quid pro quos, actually, let's put the lie to that. Let's reject that entirely. Extend hospitality, show grace, extend invitations. For those who by the status and structure and priority and privileges of this world, those who by the rules of this world have nothing to offer you, who have nothing to repay you. And your repayment will come at the resurrection of the righteous. Again, for those of you who know me, you will know that one of my soapboxes that I do not hesitate to get on is that resurrection of the righteous is not some individualistic reward either. That resurrection of the righteous that Jesus calls us to anticipate is, in fact, that new dynamic reality of God's grace in which those values of this world are indeed upended, and that is the reward, the prize that we anticipate in our call to embody the values of God's kingdom in this world. And I will be very honest, it is hard for me to read this gospel for this week, especially with that language of repayment, to avoid the conversation that is so prevalent right now in our world regarding loans and repayment and loan forgiveness. And I want to be very, very clear, I am not trying to speak to any specific political policy or, specifics of what is happening in the world, because I am definitely not an economist and I do not have the expertise to speak to the practicalities of any policies that are up for debate. And we can have, and I'm sure there's a range of opinions in this congregation, and we can have a very real conversation about that. However, I am a priest and a pastor who has done some thinking about Christianity in my life. And it is very interesting for me to see in sort of the public discourse around loan forgiveness, many politicians and public figures who have set themselves up as Christian voices to be so adamantly and ideologically opposed to the idea of loan forgiveness. The idea that someone might get away without repaying what they owe. The idea that someone might get away with something that they don't deserve. And it is troubling for me on a purely abstract, theological, philosophical level to reconcile the Christian faith with an ideological opposition to the idea of debt forgiveness. Because that seems to not sit with Jesus' entire being and ministry and purpose, which is to upend the entire idea of easy quid pro quo transactional exchange. The expectation and the payment of one thing for another. The economy of God's grace comes up in harsh conflict with the economy of our world, whether that is in purely financial terms or the weird economy we have of social capital and looking for each other to do for us, and the complicated web that we weave. I wonder what it means for us to really embody and embrace that dynamic, kind of offensive, kind of unsettling economy of God's grace against what we are taught to value and how we are taught to navigate the economy of this world, and how truly transformational that vision of God's reality could be. Amen. Thanks be to God.